I told him I admired him not just for saving a species, but because I, more than most, could imagine what it is to have a falcon achieve orgasm on my head. Listen, I told the ornithologist, I was recently sitting alone on a porch I long ago considered a sort of sexual loitering ground, hurting but praying, but hurting but praying. You know the drill. When a lust-crazed male, red-shafted flicker suddenly chased a female onto a rafter not 3 feet over my head, mounted her, and screwed her so ardently, her wings finally went limp and hung down toward me like two exquisite garments she'd removed. Their bliss so smote me, I told the ornithologist, that late the same night, while my wife was out dancing, two dream flickers again fused o'er my head, and though not a feather, hand, or talon touched me, their passion flew in and in and in till it drew forth from some lost chasm of bliss the fiercest nocturnal emission of my life. I told how I woke, wet and breathless, sensing wings, wildly aware that we are never alone. I felt, to be precise, loved by what had happened. More loved physically than I'd been in years. It was this love, I told the ornithologist, that enabled me to accept my wife's wish to leave me. So I was wondering if he too had felt it, this love, from his peregrines. In the Brothers Karamazov, I told the ornithologist, Father Zosima says, all is an ocean. All flows and connects so powerfully that if, in this life, you manage to become more gracious by even a drop, it is better for every bird, child, and animal your life touches than you will ever know. Start praying to birds as if in an ecstasy, old Zosima entreats. Cherish this ecstasy however senseless it may seem to people. So I do. Those flickers pierced me, I told the ornithologist. In a dark time, their wild love touched me as your falcons and bowing and chee-yips and crazy hat have touched me. I trust you now see why a small photo of the hat at this time in my life would be a kind of holy icon for me. The ornithologist, of course, never answered my letter. The wild birds, of course, have never stopped. Thank you. So what I've found touring this book the last 14 days is that I have lots of endurance as a storyteller, but I don't have much endurance at all as a preacher. And there's a lot of churchless sermons, as they're called in this book. So those of you who are preachers, I admire your stamina. But I've been finding myself gravitating more and more towards the humor in the book and towards the pieces that are more like stories. And maybe this story kind of goes with the poem about a painful time that I just wrote. So this is a sad story, but I think it's beautiful. I know 3 couples whose relationships lasted almost exactly as long as the life of each couple's dog. Oddly, all 3 included a writer, and all 3 dogs were border collies. The trios were Barry Lopez, his ex-wife Sandra, and their dog Desert, the poet Jane Hirschfield, her ex-partner Michael, and their dog Maggie, and me, my ex-wife Alice, and our dog Hafiz Pancake. A Hafiz is a man who's memorized the entire Quran. Hafiz Pancake was a dog who'd memorized the fact that he loved my homemade buttermilk pancakes. Not long after a divorce decree euthanized my first marriage, I held Pancake in my lap while a vet did the same for him. At the instant of death, I was unexpectedly jerked out of sorrow by something rationalists will consider impossible. Paul Auster speaks to this kind of impossibility when he writes, "A thing that isn't there is there." W.B. Yeats does the same when he says, "There is another world, but it is in this one." The Tibetan Buddhist scholar Robert Thurman goes even Yeats one better. Encircling the Sacred Mountain, Thurman writes, "All beings are. They never are not. They are either alive or between. There is, hypothetically, a split second between life and the between that is properly called death, a boundary, a line with no width, something ultimately not there except as an arbitrary border. Holding my steadfast old dog up to and through the instant he left his body, I somehow glimpsed this border. The experience was beautiful beyond words and transformed for good, the way I hear the term border collie. When I later tried to write of the experience, though, I ran into a familiar wall. The event hadn't really been personal, it had been spiritual, and only the spirit has spiritual experiences. So when the limited I tries to write of such experiences, the soul and mystery of them vanish, and what remains are what Thomas Mertens calls itsy-bitsy statues of a spiritual experience. I abandoned my attempt. Years passed. Then one day, while I was lost in the effort to create a long work of fiction, that same magic Flannery O'Connor was talking about in the quote I read about getting lost in De Borja, a character in my story unexpectedly and almost effortlessly underwent the very experience that I, as an I, had been unable to capture at all. The pages that follow are that fragment, and this is a magic fragment for me because in a real sense, no I, no me has written it. Not till my I disappeared could it be written, so I hope the fragment speaks not to you, Fred, or Melissa, or Bobby, or Jane, but to the spirit, the thing that isn't there, the soul, thing that isn't there yet is there within us. So this is called Romeo Shows Jamie the Door. And it begins with a quote from that wonderful movie, Shakespeare in Love. The theater manager says, "Love and a bit with a dog, that's what they want." On March 1st, 2000, the Portland actor and playwright Jamie Van Zandt held his best friend in his arms, nodded to the doctor standing over them, then watched that doctor, in obedience to his nod, end his friend's life with a lethal injection. This world being a cauldron of war, violent separation, murders, sudden injuries, and suffering, it's anticlimactic to admit that this friend was just a black and tan border collie named Romeo, but it's true. Jamie loved a lot of people a little, and a few people a lot. But in duration of intimacy, he'd been closer to Romeo than to any human he'd ever lived with. And even in degree of intimacy, he'd been closer to Romeo than to anyone but his wife, Risa. Romeo spent 17 years glued to Jamie's side, incessantly and non-judgmentally imbibing his master's most intimate moods and odors. 17 years jumping out of sleep just to dog Jamie's random pacing during wee hour insomnia attacks. Risa and Jamie were close, but not the way Romeo and Jamie were. Risa didn't spend her formative years sleeping on Jamie's feet. When Jamie was attending college classes, she didn't lie upon his rancid old tennis shoe in the hall outside because the shoe was the one thing on earth that would keep her from howling. She didn't insist every morning on following Jamie to lie outside the locked bathroom as he moved his bowels, nor did she greet him when he opened the door, greet him thousands of times in a row with grins and tail wags of such ecstatically congratulatory delight that Jamie, by God, came to feel he really had accomplished something wonderful in there.